You're 13 years old, and the most powerful men in England are discussing your womb like it's a piece of property. Your small hands shake as you overhear hushed conversations about bloodlines, inheritance, and the child you're expected to produce. The year is 1456, and you are Lady Margaret Beaufort. Your husband has just died in Welsh captivity, leaving you widowed, pregnant, and completely alone in a world that's about to tear itself apart. But you don't know yet that the baby growing inside your child-sized body will become Henry VII, the man who will end the bloodiest civil war in English history and found the Tudor dynasty that will reshape the world forever. This isn't just another medieval tale of political marriage and dynastic struggle. This is the story of how a girl barely past childhood endured trauma that would break most adults, survived betrayals that destroyed kingdoms, and ultimately orchestrated one of the greatest political comebacks in history. Her journey from that terrified pregnant child to the woman who put her son on England's highest throne is a masterpiece of survival strategy and maternal devotion that defies every expectation of what was possible for women in the 15th century. Margaret Beaufort was born into a world where your bloodline determined everything, and hers carried both incredible privilege and deadly danger. Through her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, she descended from John of Gaunt, the fourth son of Edward III. This wasn't just noble ancestry. This was royal blood that could either elevate you to unimaginable heights or get you executed as a threat to whoever currently sat on England's throne. Her father's death when she was barely a year old set the tone for everything that followed. John Beaufort had commanded English forces during the final, disastrous phases of the 100 Years' War, watching helplessly as territory won by Henry V slipped away piece by piece. The military failures ate at him like acid. When he returned to England in 1444, courtiers noted his hollow eyes and trembling hands. He spoke little, ate less, and spent hours staring at nothing. On May 27th, 1444, he was found dead in his chambers. The official cause was fever, but those who knew him understood the truth. Whether by blade, poison, or simply the crushing weight of failure, John Beaufort had chosen death over living with dishonor. This left Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp, to navigate one of the most dangerous periods in English history with an infant daughter, whose royal blood made her both valuable and vulnerable. The Dowager Duchess understood the rules of survival in a world where women and children existed primarily as tools for cementing political alliances. By age 6, little Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The contract bound two of England's most powerful families, but politics moved faster than childhood. When Suffolk fell from grace and was brutally murdered while crossing the English Channel in 1450, that betrothal became worthless paper. Suffolk's crime had been negotiating terms with France that enraged both the nobility and common people. His death was savage even by the standards of the time. Pirates or political enemies dragged him from his ship, forced him to kneel on the gunwale, and struck off his head with a rusty sword that required multiple clumsy blows. The Beaufort women learned early that survival meant constant adaptation to changing circumstances. Margaret's next betrothal came swiftly, this time to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. The Tudors were Welsh newcomers with questionable legitimacy, but they possessed something more valuable than ancient bloodlines. They had King Henry VI's favor. Owen Tudor had been a court official who caught the eye of Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow. Their secret marriage scandalized the nobility, but produced two sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, whom Henry VI recognized and elevated to the peerage. In 1455, when Margaret was approximately 12 years old, she married Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that sealed political alliances with words of love she barely understood. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, where she had spent her childhood. The great hall was decorated with tapestries, depicting the deeds of her Beaufort ancestors. while the chapel where they exchanged vows contained the tomb of her grandfather. Edmund Tudor was a seasoned man in his 20s who had been hardened by war and politics. Margaret was still growing out of her childhood clothes. The marriage was consummated immediately. There was no concept of waiting for physical maturity in an age when noble girls were treated as vessels for dynastic ambitions. The wedding night was a trauma that Margaret never spoke of in later life, but the evidence of its impact would be written in her body as permanent damage, and her lifelong religious devotion that bordered on obsession. Within months of her wedding, Margaret's body began changing in ways that terrified her young mind. The older women around her spoke in hushed tones about her condition, their faces mixing joy for a potential heir with deep concern for such a young mother. Margaret's own mother watched her daughter's growing belly with profound anxiety. She had been 18 when Margaret was born, old enough to survive childbirth safely. At 12, soon to be 13, Margaret was attempting something that had killed countless women older and stronger than herself. But Edmund Tudor would never see his child born. In autumn 1456, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The circumstances of his capture and subsequent death remain wrapped in the fog of civil war and political intrigue. Some accounts suggest he was taken during a surprise attack. Others hint at betrayal from within his own ranks. Whether he died of plague in his prison cell or was murdered by his captors remains one of history as unsolved mysteries. What we know for certain is that by November 1456, 13-year-old Margaret was a widow, pregnant, and utterly alone in a world that was exploding into the chaos that would become known as the Wars of the Roses. The news of Edmund's death reached her at Lampthe Palace in Pembrokeshire, where she had been staying while her husband campaigned. The messenger arrived on a rain-soaked November evening, his horse lathered with sweat from a desperate ride across Wales. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, took responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law. The decision was both chivalrous and practical. Margaret carried the potential heir to the Tudor line, the child who might continue their family's royal connection. He brought her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where massive stone walls offered protection from the growing chaos outside. Pembroke was a fortress at the edge of the world, perched on cliffs above Milford Haven, where Atlantic waves crashed endlessly against the rocks below. Here, in this remote Welsh castle, Margaret would endure the most harrowing experience of her young life, an ordeal that would nearly kill her, but ultimately give England one of its most consequential kings. The journey to Pembroke in her advanced pregnancy was an ordeal that tested Margaret's endurance to its absolute limits. Winter roads were barely passable, rutted with frozen mud and blocked by fallen trees. She traveled in a horse-drawn litter, each jolt and bump sending waves of pain through her swollen body. What should have been a 2-day journey stretched to 5 as they navigated flooded rivers and avoided bands of armed men whose loyalties were unknown in the chaos of civil war. Pembroke Castle in winter was a harsh refuge, built not for comfort but for survival. The fortress dominated the landscape for miles around, its great round keep nearly 80 feet high, having withstood sieges and storms for 3 centuries. The castle's chambers were cold and draughty, warmed only by great fireplaces that devoured wood faster than servants could supply it. Margaret's rooms were hung with thick tapestries to block the wind that whistled through every crack in the ancient stones. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was particularly brutal. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and the sea wind howled through every gap in the stonework. Margaret, her belly heavy with child, could barely walk the length of her chamber without exhausting herself. Her body, still that of a child in many ways, struggled under the burden it carried. The castle's physician examined her with growing alarm, confiding to Jasper Tudor that her hips were too narrow, the child positioned badly. Birth would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. Dr. Lewis Carlearn was a man who had delivered children to queens and peasants alike. He had studied at Oxford and Paris, accumulated 40 years of experience in the healing arts. But as he examined the pregnant child in his care, all his learning seemed inadequate. Margaret's pelvis had not fully developed. The baby within her womb was large, positioned wrong, and showing signs of distress. He confided his fears to Jasper Tudor during a private meeting in the castle solar. Snow swirled outside the arrow-slit windows as the two men discussed Margaret's fate in whispers. Carleon was blunt about what he had seen before in similar situations. They could attempt to turn the baby, but that might kill both patients immediately. They could wait, hoping nature would correct the position, but delay increased the risk to both mother and child. Or they could attempt a caesarean birth, a procedure that was almost invariably fatal to the mother. Jasper Tudor, barely 25 himself, faced the terrible burden of deciding his sister-in-law's fate. If Margaret died, the Tudor line would end with him, a younger son with no legitimate heirs of his own. If she lived but lost the child, the same result would follow. The political implications weighed heavily, but so did personal affection. He had grown genuinely fond of the brave, intelligent girl who had faced widowhood with such dignity. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed through the dark winter months, she displayed a maturity that belied her years. She spent her time learning everything she could about politics and statecraft, understanding instinctively that knowledge would be her greatest weapon in the struggles ahead. Jasper became her tutor in the arts of survival, teaching her to read people's faces, to hear unspoken messages behind diplomatic language, to understand the complex web of alliances and enmities that governed noble society. Margaret also threw herself into religious study with an intensity that worried her attendants. She spent hours in the castle chapel, praying before the altar until her knees were raw and bleeding. She memorized Latin prayers, studied theological texts, and developed the deep personal relationship with God that would sustain her through decades of political struggle. Her extreme religiosity seemed to begin as a coping mechanism for the trauma of child marriage and impending motherhood, a way to impose meaning on suffering that otherwise seemed senseless. The castle's priest, Father Meredith, became another crucial figure in Margaret's education. A Welshman educated at Cambridge before taking holy orders, he understood both classical learning and the practical politics of survival in a violent world. He taught Margaret that God often worked through human agency, that prayer without action was empty, but action guided by prayer could move mountains. On that January night in 1457, Margaret's labor began with pains that doubled her over while she was walking the castle battlements, taking the exercise that Dr. Carleon insisted was necessary for her health. When the first contraction struck, the pain was unlike anything she had experienced, a crushing, tearing sensation that seemed to split her body in half. She collapsed against the stone ramparts, gasping, while her attending ladies rushed to help her back to her chambers. The midwives, experienced women who had delivered countless babies, exchanged glances heavy with meaning. They had seen this before, a child trying to give birth to a child, nature pushed beyond its limits by human ambition and political necessity. They prepared their instruments and said their prayers, knowing that before dawn, one or both of their patients might be dead. Dame Gwen Firk Davith, the head midwife, was a woman who had been delivering babies for 30 years. She had learned her craft from her mother and grandmother, inheriting secrets passed down through generations of Welsh women. She knew herbs that could ease pain, techniques for turning breech babies, and prayers that seemed to give strength to laboring mothers. But as she examined Margaret, her weathered face grew grave. The other midwives prepared their instruments with grim efficiency. There were knives for cutting birth cords, but also for procedures too horrible to contemplate. There were hooks and forceps for extracting stillborn children, potions to strengthen weak mothers, and holy relics to call upon divine intervention. The chamber filled with smoke from burning herbs, lavender for calming, rosemary for strength, and other plants whose properties were known only to the women who tended births and deaths. For 18 hours, Margaret labored in agony that defied description. Her screams echoed off the stone walls until her voice gave out entirely, leaving only gasping animal sounds of suffering. The midwives worked frantically, their hands slick with blood as they tried to save both mother and child. Dame Gwen used every technique in her considerable arsenal: massage, positioning changes, herbal remedies, and constant encouragement whispered in Margaret's ear. Jasper Tudor paced the corridors outside, his boots clicking against the stone flags, knowing that the future of his family line might die in that chamber. He could hear Margaret's screams through the heavy oak door, each one cutting through him like a blade. Servants hurried past with basins of hot water and armloads of clean linen, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. As dawn approached, Margaret's strength began to fail. She had been in labor for nearly a full day, her young body pushed far beyond its limits. Dr. Carleon examined her and spoke in urgent whispers with Dame Gwen. The baby was alive, but in distress, its heartbeat irregular and weak. Margaret was bleeding internally, her pulse thready, her skin pale as parchment. The decision was made to attempt manual extraction, a dangerous procedure that might save the child at the cost of the mother's life. Dame Gwen positioned Margaret carefully, praying silently to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth, as she prepared to reach inside the young woman's body and guide the baby into the world. When the baby finally emerged, torn from Margaret's body in a process that nearly killed her, the midwives held their breath. The infant was pale, barely breathing, covered in blood and birthing fluid. For a terrifying moment, the chamber was silent, except for Margaret's labored breathing and the crackling of the fire. Then Dame Gwen cleared the baby's mouth and throat, and a thin, angry wail filled the air, announcing the arrival of Henry Tudor, future King of England. Margaret, barely conscious, her young body shattered by the ordeal, heard her son's first cry through a haze of pain and exhaustion. She tried to reach for him, but her arms would not obey her mind's commands. Dame Gwen placed the baby on Margaret's chest for a brief moment, the traditional first meeting between mother and child, before rushing him to the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes followed the infant with desperate intensity, memorizing every detail of his tiny face before he was taken away. The damage to Margaret's body was catastrophic and permanent. Dr. Carleon, examining her in the days following the birth, found extensive tearing and internal injuries that would never fully heal. He spoke in whispers of damaged organs and blood loss that had nearly proved fatal. The brutal truth was inescapable. She would never bear another child. This single traumatic birth had ended her reproductive years before they had properly begun. At 13, she was effectively barren, her body sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics. The physical recovery was agonizingly slow. For weeks, Margaret hovered between life and death, racked by fever and infection. Dr. Carleon applied every remedy in his arsenal: bloodletting to balance her humors, herbal poultices to fight infection, and strong wines fortified with medicinal herbs to restore her strength. Dame Gwen never left her side, spooning broth between Margaret's cracked lips and monitoring every change in her condition. But Margaret's psychological recovery proved even more complex. The trauma manifested in nightmares that left her screaming in the small hours of the night. She developed an intense fear of physical contact, flinching away from even the gentlest touch of her attendants. Her relationship with her newborn son became complicated by the association between his presence and her pain. She loved him desperately, but could barely tolerate holding him without being overwhelmed by memories of his violent birth. Yet if Margaret Beaufort's body was broken, her spirit remained unshattered. As she recovered slowly in the months following Henry's birth, she began to display the iron will and calculating intelligence that would make her one of the most formidable women in English history. She understood, even in her weakened state, that her son represented something far greater than just another noble child. He was the future of the Tudor line, and potentially the salvation of the Lancastrian cause. Margaret Beaufort's journey from that screaming 13-year-old in a Welsh castle to the woman who orchestrated her son's rise to the throne stands as one of history's most extraordinary transformations. Her body was broken by political ambition, her childhood stolen by dynastic necessity, yet she forged an unbreakable will from that suffering. The girl who nearly died bringing Henry Tudor into the world would spend the next 3 decades plotting, scheming, and surviving to put him on England's throne. Sometimes the greatest victories are born from the deepest wounds, and Margaret's story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we might be creating something that will reshape the world